And our next speaker is Sourya Biswas, and he's going to talk about cybersecurity is war, lessons from historical conflicts. He's going to take a look back at wars, years and years and years ago, and how to look at that to learn about cybersecurity in 2020 and on. Hi, Sourya.
Hello there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Have a great talk. Take it away.
All right. So let me just start sharing my screen and let me know if it is visible. All right. Is my screen visible? Can you guys see my screen? Hello. Was my screen visible earlier? Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah. I just saw the chat. Just let me get back to the screen again. 1 second. All right, perfect. All right. Good afternoon, guys. It's a pleasure to be here speaking to you at BSides Connecticut. The topic of my presentation today is cybersecurity is war, lessons from historical conflicts. Now, this is not as technical a session as some of the ones that I've had the pleasure of sitting through today. There are no log snapshots, there are no tool screens, but hopefully I can retain your interest for the next hour or 40 odd minutes on a Saturday evening. I feel that this is something that is relevant today, and that's what this is about. My name is Sourya Biswas. The bunch of letters after my name show that I'm good at taking tests which involve multiple choice questions. Hopefully that translate well into me being a better security consultant, because that's what I have. I work at the NCC Group. We pride ourselves in being the largest pure play cybersecurity consulting firm in the world. And I have had the privilege of working as a consultant advising security teams, as well as part of such security teams availing of consulting services. I've worked across industries and in organizations of different sizes and maturities. What you can determine from that headshot on the left is that is one example where I'm okay with using deprecated information, unlike most things security. One thing you'll notice that I am definitely not a military expert. However, I'm an enthusiast of military history. So just one quick second while I ensure that everybody is able to see this. I just want to check out the chat. All right, perfect, good. Thank you. I'll get back to sharing my screen again. Sorry for that. All right, cool. As I said, I am not a military expert, but I'm an enthusiast of military history, and I've tried to merge my passion with my profession. Specifically, this presentation combines my general interest in the history of warfare with my experience working in InfoSec. Now, why am I calling cybersecurity as being like similar to a conventional war? What are the parallels here? So I'd like to start off by quoting this Italian philosopher, because this is all about learning from history. And he wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." I'm sure you have heard this quote in one flavor or the other. Now, speaking about the parallels, right? If you think about conventional war, that basically involves an attacker, a defender, or like two parties at conflict fighting over a valuable asset, right? It has happened in the past. It has happened in the ancient past. In recent past, it's happening now. It's going to happen in the future. The picture on the right, the silhouette, that soldier on the left, you can see that person is holding an American weapon while the soldier on the right is holding an AK series rifle. the picture, the map, that's the Fulda Gap in Germany. And that is the area where for several decades, NATO feared that the Warsaw Pact countries of the Soviet bloc, the tanks would actually roll through in an invasion. Now, today, right? I mean, today again, we have a similar situation in cybersecurity, right? We have attackers, the bad guys, and the defenders, people like us, fighting over valuable assets, usually information, and of course, we are using multiple tools. And of course, as you can see, that history keeps repeating itself. Now, before I move on to the core of this presentation, which is about learning from historical conflicts, I would like to first take like a minute to explain how we have divided the different historical eras, right? So I have divided the history of mankind, or specifically the history of human conflict, into three eras: ancient, medieval, and modern. These kind of align with how the history of mankind is divided by historians. I don't go back as far as like the Paleolithic era, the Stone Age, and all that, but I start off as early as 2,500 years ago. And I would like to start off by quoting Aristotle, also an ancient philosopher. You will see I use quotes a lot. I kind of love them because I think they help bring context, right, outside like technology or anything like that. And Aristotle said that war is a school for virtue, right? So war brings out the best in people, right? Unfortunately, the best in people, that includes the attackers as well. And in our case, where we are the defenders, the enemy's best is obviously not good for us. Now, the first example that I would like to cover are the ancient Greeks and military ciphers, right? So now this diagram that you see on the this picture that you see on the left, right? This is the earliest example of steganography, right? So steganography is the technique of hiding secret data within an ordinary non-secret file or message. So what would happen is that a secret message would be tattooed onto the on the head of a slave, right? On a shaved head, the hair would be allowed to grow out, and then that person would be sent across enemy lines, right, to their forces, to allied forces, where the head would be shaved off and the message would be revealed, right? And this particular example was mentioned as being used around 500 BC by Herodotus. Herodotus is called the father of history. And as you can see that obviously this message must not have been time critical, right? Because it does take time for hair to grow out and cover the message, right, before it can be subsequently shaved off. But it's interesting how the Greeks kind of use this of like hiding secret data in plain sight. Another example that I would like to talk about is the CITIL cipher, right? Here, a piece of parchment across a rod would be wrapped around a rod and written across. And this picture is very good at explaining this, right? So if you think about it, you can see the message, right? Send more troops to southern flank land. Obviously, this is not in ancient Greek, but it kind of conveys the essential of this particular cipher. So once this piece of paper is unwrapped, then it would be a gibberish sequence of letters, right? So in this case, it would be STSF, then ERO, and only the message would be revealed in its entirety only if the paper is wrapped again around a rod of the same diameter, right? This is called the CITIL cipher. CITIL, the word comes from the Greek word for baton, scutel. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation. But this was, again, estimated to have been used around 400 BC, right? Again, you can see that this is like similar to symmetric encryption today, right? Where the same key is used to encrypt and decrypt data. In this case, the key would be the diameter of the rod. And this is obviously information that must have been decided beforehand between the sender and the recipient. Now, from this example, what is the lesson to be learned, right? The first lesson is know your data, right? By the way, this meme on the right, I extensively use Star Wars memes. So I hope there are Star Wars fans out there in the audience. So coming back to the lesson, as I said, knowing your data, right? Storage is cheap, right? So it's important to reduce data sprawl, because if you don't know that it exists in the first place, you won't be able to protect it. And the second part of this is that you should only collect and store what you need, because if you collect everything, or rather a lot, you basically have to also protect that large piece of information, right? I mean, wherever that data exists. So the advantage is, if you collect less, you don't have to protect it. The second lesson is kind of obvious, that you encrypt sensitive data, and that includes encryption at rest, in use, in transit, but encrypt only what you need to protect, right? Because there is a performance cost. There's a performance cost to encrypt data as well as decrypt data. And of course, you should leverage appropriate tools and techniques, thereby avoiding insecure protocols like TLS 1.1 and lower, avoiding insecure algorithms, right? Like this MD5 SHA-1. NIST actually has authoritative guidance around this. So the general rule of thumb is to follow NIST guidance. The second example from ancient conflicts is the Battle of Thermopylae and the 300 brave Spartans, who basically they were part of the most famous last stand in the history of warfare. The picture that you see is the picture of the actual pass in Thermopylae. It is only 46 feet wide across, and that enabled only 7,000 Greeks to hold off 200,000 Persians, because a few people standing side by side can basically block that pass. Of course, any mention of the Battle of Thermopylae is not incomplete without a mention of the graphic novel by Frank Miller, which was faithfully brought to the big screen by Zack Snyder. Of course, there were certain liberties taken with history. For example, if you have seen the movie, the Persian Emperor Xerxes was not a giant with strange body piercings. There is no record of war elephants being actually used in that battle. Of course, the meme, you can see that is the battle cry of "This is Sparta." That actually lends itself to memes, and that is what I've done here. I love the quote in this movie, which says, "Go tell the Spartans passerby that here by Spartan law we lie." This is actually on the gravestone, or rather the memorial stone that has been erected at that place. So now that we have the example, what is the lesson to be learned here? The lesson is to reduce the attack surface, right? It's all about hardening your environment, and that's why I have that meme of Han Solo hardened in carbonite. Hardening includes hardening your networks, right? So that you have a single point of entry to a trusted network, Bastion host, which allows traffic from whitelisted IPs only, the firewall, which denies all traffic by default other than what is specifically allowed in. And then once inside the trusted network, you can implement hardening by segmentation, by dividing the network into subnetworks and controlling traffic between them. You also have containerization, getting increasingly popular nowadays, where you run apps in isolated processes. You can harden your servers by disabling unnecessary ports, because any unnecessary port, any open port technically can be used to exfiltrate data and infiltrate malware. And any open port can be forced to respond to traffic requests. This can lead to denial of service. So obviously you can see the first two kind of affect confidentiality and integrity of the CIA triad. The second point affects availability of the CIA triad. So pretty much all three elements of CIA can be affected by unnecessary ports left open. You can harden endpoints. And again, this is something that I've seen with a lot of my clients in Silicon Valley, where there is a culture of trust, right? They believe in not monitoring employee activity. They believe in giving employees every kind of access, right? Basically, they can use anything to get the job done. In other words, they have a full local admin access. They can install anything. They can even uninstall software, and that can include things like the antivirus, right? So as you can understand, this is not really conducive to good security. And that's why hardening endpoints can involve disabling local admin privileges and allowing installation of whitelisted applications only. Now, the final example in ancient conflict that I would like to cover is Hannibal and the crossing of the Alps. So Hannibal was a Carthaginian general. They were like traditional enemies with the Romans. Now, here I think I would like to just mention this quote by Sun Tzu in The Art of War. And he wrote that if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. So Hannibal actually implemented this in practice, right? He knew, right, around 250 BC, that the Roman Navy was all powerful, especially in the Mediterranean seas. So he didn't want to go through the Roman Navy, right? The chance of success was lower. So he decided to circumvent the Navy and attack from the supposedly impregnable north, where basically the Alps stood. So he crossed the Alps, right? Hannibal crossed the Alps, and he did it with war elephants, right? And this seems kind of like unimaginable, right? And in fact, to the Romans, it was, right? Hannibal, once he crossed the Alps, he won a string of great victories. He was ultimately defeated, right? But such was the shock and awe, right, of this particular attack, that even after centuries after Hannibal's attack, the cry of Hannibal is at the gates, that was a common exclamation of fear in the Roman lexicon. And by the way, this actually happened. Scientists have found proof of mass animal deposition. In other words, a lot of animals defecating, because other than 37 war elephants, there were around 9,000 horses. And there's actual proof that Hannibal did cross the Alps with this huge army. So what's the lesson to be learned here? The cybersecurity lesson is expect the unexpected, right? And that includes considering unexpected threat actors. For example, state actors, right? Is your IP valuable enough? As cybersecurity consultant or as cybersecurity professionals, you must consider the possibility that your IP is valuable enough to attract unwanted attention from state actors. For example, I had this client this organization worked on quantum computing, right? So cutting edge of research, but they were a very small organization, right? They didn't even consider that they would be targeted by Chinese state actors until it actually happened, right? So maybe even if you're a small organization, is your IP is that valuable to attract that kind of unwanted attention? Now, with organized crime, is your information lucrative enough? Can your information be stolen and sold, right, for a profit? Is it lucrative enough to justify the level of effort that organized crime syndicates would kind of spend to get access to that data? In terms of activists, is your organization unpopular enough to get, again, that kind of unwanted attention, right? Are you in the news, or are you associated with any kind of movement that can basically make you a target for activists? Also, part of this lesson would be considering unexpected attack vectors, right? Are you securing your entire environment, right? What about your third-party vendors and contractors? Are you restricting their access to the minimum required to do the job? Are you monitoring what they do? Are you ensuring that once they have access to your data, that they're actually protecting the data? One example that I would like to mention here is the Target breach, right? So in 2013, hackers stole data across approximately 40 million credit card and debit card information, and this breach was traced to network credentials stolen from the HVAC provider, Fazio Mechanical Services, that were then used to implant malware in Target's point-of-sale terminals, right? So you can see that while Target may have been diligent in securing its own environment, it is possible that this diligence may not have carried over in assessing its third parties or their connectivity to the target network, right? Thereby opening up this unexpected opportunity for the cyber attackers, for the cyber criminals. Then, in order to identify these possible threat actors and vectors which may be applicable to you, you should do your due diligence, right? You should do threat modeling and risk assessments, run regular vulnerability scans, and now you can actually leverage machine learning for proactive threat hunting. So you no longer have to wait for something bad to happen. You don't have to detect an indicator of compromise, but you can detect possibly an attack that is going to happen, right? And that is like an indicators of attack. So you don't have to wait. You don't have to react. You can actually go out and do things proactively. Now, that kind of ends the examples and lessons from ancient conflicts. Now I'm moving on to medieval conflicts and the cybersecurity lessons that can be learned from those. Again, a quote, and I would like to quote again this great conqueror from the medieval age, Genghis Khan. And he said, conquering the world on horseback is easy. It is dismounting and governing that is hard. So I think this translates very well to today, right? I mean, if you think about it, we are trying to maintain the status quo, right, as cybersecurity professionals, and we have to be right all the time. Whereas attackers need to be right only once. They want to change the status quo, so to speak. And the Mongols, that's the first example that I would like to mention, the Mongols and professional mobile warfare. So in the 12th century, when Genghis Khan operated, most kingdoms had conscript armies, right? Farmers who were given weapons to fight. However, the Mongols under Genghis Khan had a professional army. They trained for war. And what's more, it was a true meritocracy. For example, Subutai, he was perhaps the greatest Mongol general. He was the son of a blacksmith and started his military career as a guard to Genghis Khan's tent. And you can see that the result of this professionalism, that the Mughal Empire, covering 9.27 million square miles, was the largest, or actually it was the second largest until it was stopped by the British Empire, but that to 700 years later. Another defining aspect of the Mongols was speed, right? This enabled them to attack from multiple fronts, feign retreats, and circle back to attack again. And for this purpose, they trained for this purpose. They lived off the land, right? So they didn't have like long foot trains to slow down the progress of advance. And each soldier rode with 4 to 5 horses, so no one particular animal would tire out. As a result, the Mongol army could move as fast as 100 miles a day, right? Completely unimaginable in those days. And as a result, the forces of Hungary and Poland were defeated on consecutive days, right? This was like completely unexpected, especially in that era. So what is the lesson? What is the cybersecurity lesson to be learned here? So there are two that I would like to mention: focus training and improving speed of response. So the first one, providing role-based security training. So again, I've seen this at many clients. They have like a general security awareness training and that's it, nothing more. While that is important, it is necessary, it is not enough, right? It should be supplemented with role-based training. And this can be based on the job description. For example, incident responder should receive specific IR training. And it can also depend on privileged access, right? For example, administrators, executives, they have additional access. And for example, like the executives, right? They are targeted in phishing scams, right? And this targeted phishing scams towards executives, they actually have a term for that called whaling, right? Because the whales are the big animals, executives are the big, are the people who have the big access, right? They have privileged access, right? So let's say if somebody phishes an executive, steals the credentials, sends an email to accounts department asking for a payment to be made to a third party, like it's not a vendor, but basically a fraud account, it is less likely that the recipient of the email, the accounts personnel, would actually push back because that email is actually coming from that executive, let's say the CEO. And there's a term for this, right? It's called business email compromise. And the FBI actually had put out information saying how big a problem that is. The next lesson is to respond to security incidents quicker. I feel that this meme about the 80 workers, this is relevant, right? Because if you have seen the film, you have seen that they are really slow and unwieldy, and that's why the Rebel Alliance could literally fly rings around them. So responding to incidents quicker is obviously very important, right? Earlier it is contained and recovered, the lesser the impact, and there's numbers to back it up. This cost of data breach study found out that if that detection to containment window is more than 200 days, the cost is 4.56 million. If it is less than 200 days, the cost falls by more than $1 million. Of course, in order to respond, you first have to detect that incident, right? So you can't respond if you can't detect an incident. And for that purpose, you should have suitable tools and, very important, the human resources to use those tools. It's not enough to just implement tooling without having enough people to, let's say, respond to such alerts. And speaking of alerts, the tools should be configured properly. The rules should be set up to reduce or, if not eliminate, but reduce the false positives. Moving on to the next example from medieval conflicts, Crusader concentric castles. Now you can, the picture is self-explanatory. You can see these like different concentric layers of walls, right? And this started in the Crusader region. Earliest example is from 12th century AD. And the outer wall, it protected from siege engines, while the inner wall provided outflanking fire. Now, this concept became popular. It spread outside the areas of Israel. Of course, there was no Israel then, but it spread to Europe as well. And this the other picture is from Wales. And the concept also expanded to cities. Now, what's the lesson to be drawn from this particular example? The lesson is to establish defense in depth, right? And this is very pertinent because if you think about it, the traditional defense in depth, right, with administrative, physical, and technical controls across like different layers protecting a trusted environment. Another word for that is the castle approach, right? So you can see that there is definitely a parallel here. Of course, as assets have moved away from on-prem to the cloud, there has been more modern implementations of defense in depth. You have the network-driven, the OSI 7 layer, and then there's also the FAN approach, right, where you have controls protecting the perimeter, the network, endpoint, app, data separately. One important takeaway is not to ignore physical security, right? Even if you are in the cloud. And I had a client, the CEO, he actually mentioned, he said that my production environment is in the cloud. I don't need physical security. So this organization was housed in a building with shared access, as in like that building had offices of other firms. There were multiple doors, right? There was no badge system. There was no CCTV surveillance, right? So I told him that, okay, think about this hypothetical scenario that you're logged into your AWS admin account, right? And you walk off to get a cup of coffee. And I walk in and walk away with your laptop, right? Which is already logged in to your AWS account. Is that a concern for you? Well, he said yes, but then he pushed back, right? He said that, okay, I agree, but a lot of my employees who work remotely, right? I'm not enforcing physical security in their homes. So why should I do it here? So I told him that, okay, if I am targeting your organization, if I'm specifically targeting your organization, where do you think I'm going to show up, right? Where is the higher probability of me showing up? Is it your employees' homes or in your office here? So the takeaway is that even in this age of cloud, physical security matters. Now, the last example from the medieval age, medieval conflicts, and this is the first battle of Panipat and the rise of the Mughals. Now, the picture that you see on screen, the Taj Mahal, right? I mean, I'm sure you have seen this picture. This is the building that is most closely identified with my motherland, India. And this is the culmination of the Mughal dynasty, right? And Mughal dynasty held sway over India for 2 centuries. However, it had very humble origins, right? It began with this minor Uzbek chieftain called Babur. And he won this great battle, the first battle of Panipat. He won it against a superior opponent, right? This opponent, Ibrahim Lodi, he had 10 times the soldiers and he had 1,000 elephants, right? So if you think back on that example of Hannibal, right? He had 37 elephants, and that caused panic among the Romans, right? And in comparison, Lodi had 1,000 elephants. Now, war elephants were a very powerful weapon on the battlefield until Babur introduced field artillery, right? Cannons for the first time in India. And when these cannons fired, the elephants panicked, right? So they ran back and trampled their own forces, right? So what's the lesson to be learned here? What's the cybersecurity lesson? The lesson is to adapt to new challenges and opportunities. For example, adapting to new assets, right? With IoT, Internet of Things, the attack surface has substantially expanded, right? Now you have computers in pretty much anything electronic. You have smart speakers, you have smart fridges, and researchers have actually been able to hack all of them, right? Even the ECUs, the electronic control units, the small computers in your cars, they have been hacked as well, right? And I believe there was an article in Wired where a researcher was not only able to hack into the entertainment system, right? And that's not a big thing, right? You're just forced to listen to songs that you don't like. But the researcher was able to get control of the driving as well. And that is scary. Adapting to new threats, right? That is very important. I mean, ransomware wasn't that big a threat a decade back. Nowadays, not a week goes by not a week goes by and you don't hear of a ransomware event. AI-generated deepfakes, right? As I mentioned, the earlier example of business email compromise, where the CEO sends an email asking for a payment to be made. Earlier, the recipient could verify that, right? Or rather not verify it by calling up that person, right? And obviously, if the CEO hadn't made such a request, the CEO would deny, and then that payment wouldn't be made and the organization wouldn't lose money. But now the attackers can actually simulate that CEO, and not only the voice but also the face, right? And what you see on screen are obviously the good examples of using AI-generated images or AI-generated characters, right? The Grand Moff Tarkin and Princess Leia. I mean, we enjoyed those, but obviously AI-generated deepfakes are a major concern nowadays in security. So what you do, you adapt to new tools, right? You have new attack vectors, you have new technologies being used by attackers, but you have new technologies on your hand as well. For example, file integrity monitoring, right? FIM. I mean, you can use that to detect mass encryption during a ransomware attack and hopefully stop it before it spreads much further. And there are AI-based threat hunting, right? As I mentioned earlier, which looks not only at indicators of attack, not only at indicators of compromise, but also indicators of attack. So instead of reacting to something bad that has already happened, you proactively search out and find an attack before it actually happens. Now, moving on to the last era, modern conflicts, right? And the cybersecurity lessons that you can learn from those. Again, a quote, and here I'm quoting the legendary US Army General, George Patton. He said, "Battle is the most magnificent competition in which a human being can indulge. It brings out all that is best. It removes all that is base." So now, for these examples in modern conflicts, I have restricted myself to US history only, just because of the audience here. And the first example is from the American Revolutionary War. Now, it may surprise you that this is part of modern history, even though it happened 250 years earlier, right? But it makes sense, right? I mean, America is a young country. And during this war, right, Americans obviously threw off the yoke of the British Empire. And Benedict Arnold, he played a major role. He was a rising star. I mean, he was a major general during this conflict. He was admired by George Washington himself and given charge of Fort Arnold, which was again named after him, a great honor. And he was given charge of this fort. However, a belief in being passed over for promotion, and an expensive lifestyle which left him deep in debt. And finally, his wife also sympathized with the enemy, the Britishers. That led Benedict Arnold to treason, right? He planned to surrender the fort to the enemy. I mean, that plot was discovered, so he himself fled. And later on, he led British troops against the troops that he had formerly led in the US Army. So now the name Benedict Arnold is a byword for treason and betrayal. And there's a valuable lesson to be learned here, right? And I'm sure some of you can already figure that out. And that is to protect yourself against insider threats. The picture, the meme on the right, Galen Urso, right, the designer of the first Death Star, and he basically designed that exhaust port, that tiny exhaust port, where Luke could fire a torpedo, and that led to the catastrophic failure of the entire battle station. So it is very important to be aware of and protect against insider threats, because possibly an insider threat is more dangerous than an external threat. And one is that I've seen a lot of companies be very aware about external threats. At least they are cognizant of the risk there. However, with insider threat, they are not so aware, because again, there's this culture of trust. They believe that they hired the best of people. However, an insider threat, if you think about it, can compromise security easier, right? Because they already have the credentials, they already have that privileged access. And even after they do something bad, they can be more difficult to detect, right? Because again, a lot of organizations don't even think about that. So it is important to establish suitable controls around that. This can start with restricting access to information assets based on the principles of need to know and list privilege. So basically give access only what the organization, based on organization need and what is needed to do the job, the minimum needed to do the job. Eliminate conflict of interest, right? For example, if I need access to a server that I don't have today, I shouldn't be the person approving my own request, right? That's a clear conflict. That's a clear conflict of interest. Another control would be to conduct background checks and again repeat for privileged users. While most of my client organizations have seen them do background checks, very rarely I've seen background checks being repeated. But things change, right? I mean, life situations change. A person who would not be an insider threat 20 years ago, maybe that person went deep into debt, right? Maybe that person is already doing stuff which should kind of raise red flags, but nobody is doing those background checks which can help find out, right? Maybe that person, that credit history has gone real bad, but unless you repeat background checks, you won't be able to discover that. And finally, obviously, monitor for suspicious activity, right? Late logins, mass data transfers, very large printouts, maybe like taking printouts away from their own desk. So these are, again, not necessarily indicators of compromise, but they can be indicators of attack. And combined together, they can help kind of detect insider threat before that insider threat has a chance to do real harm. Now, I spoke about malicious insiders, right? But we shouldn't forget a very important threat here, the accidental insider, right? Basically, user error. And obviously, any mention of user error is not complete without a reference to Jar Jar Binks, the great blunderer in the Star Wars universe. And user error can do as much harm as a malicious insider, right? And open AWS S3 buckets. I'm sure you have read about this. You have seen this a lot. And this is a problem that keeps happening. And this is not because of a malicious insider, right? This is someone, an authorized user who is not doing their job or not doing their job incorrectly. So again, this also falls under insider threats. Now, the next example, the battle that turned the war in the Pacific. I am referring to the Battle of Midway during World War II. But first, the story starts with the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? December 7, 1941, as President Roosevelt said, a day which will live in infamy. So Japanese forces caught the US Navy unawares, right? And this was actually a very successful aerial attack. there was significant damage to the US Pacific Fleet, very little Japanese losses. The picture that you see on screen, that's actually the USS Arizona. And around 1,100 people, right, died on this ship, practically half the death toll of the attack, of the entire attack. However, things turned around 6 months later. While the attack on Pearl Harbor was a failure of US intelligence, the Battle of Midway was a triumph. During this battle, the US Navy defeated the most powerful naval force seen till date, the Imperial Japanese Navy. Excuse me. And this battle was so impactful, so monumental. Military historian John Keegan called it the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. The Japanese force lost all 4 of their aircraft carriers to only one of the US Navy and had 10 times the casualties. So this is kind of the battle which many historians feel it permanently weakened the Japanese Navy, and it definitely turned things around. And this was a huge triumph of US intelligence. So what are the lessons to be learned here? The lesson is to learn from your mistakes and keep it simple, stupid. That's KISS, right? Learn from your mistakes as well as other successes. So, as I said, the attack on Pearl Harbor, the US intelligence dropped the ball there. But 6 months later, the Americans cracked the Japanese naval codes, right? And this neutralized the careful planning of their opponents. And in cybersecurity, you can do this, right? Learn by participating in information sharing programs, such as like FBI InfraGuard. You can do it by attending conferences like this, BSides Connecticut. But even operationally, right, in your day jobs, you should conduct post-incident reviews. You should document lessons learned after incident response and business continuity tests. Then keeping it simple, again, this is very important. Get the basics right? Basics around access control, vulnerability management, security awareness, because without the basics, advanced tools won't help. Now, specifically for the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Navy, which had, as I said, a much larger fleet, but they had overly complex plans. And as a result, the Japanese fleet was dispersed too widely to press home their numerical advantage. So in cybersecurity, it is better to implement a few tools better than to have many which are not implemented properly. So you should have the mechanisms in place, as in documented procedures, and the right rules in place to trigger alerts, and of course have appropriate resources and train them to operate these tools. Then finally, it is important to be flexible. In the Battle of Midway, bound by strict Japanese doctrine, the Japanese Admiral Nagumo, he hesitated in launching his aircraft until he had the proper armaments and fighter cover and all that. In contrast, US Navy Admirals Spruance and Fletcher, they launched immediately after getting sight of the enemy. And basically, within 10 minutes, the Japanese Navy was devastated. So there was this very small window of opportunity that the US Navy was able to exploit because they were flexible. So while it is important to follow established processes, right, it is also important to be flexible. Especially if these processes are delaying decision-making, then they should be changed. Then the final example in modern conflicts and the final example of my presentation today, close encounters of the thermonuclear kind. Now, this picture that you see, it's a poster of a movie from the 90s, Broken Arrow. I'm sure a lot of you have actually seen this movie. This is an amazing action movie. And this deals with a broken arrow, right? A broken arrow being a nuclear weapon that is lost, stolen, or inadvertently detonated. Obviously, the last one has never happened, thank God. But we came actually very close in 1961. So this was happening in the 1960s when ICBMs and SLBMs, the ballistic missiles, were not very mature. So these bombers with nuclear bombs, they were the last line of defense. against the Soviets. What happened in 1961 was a B-52 bomber broke up in midair. It was carrying two 4-megaton nuclear bombs. So when these bombs fell down, one was destroyed when it hit the ground. The other one, actually, the parachute deployed. And very alarmingly, 3 of 4 arming devices activated. So just one more and it would have exploded, and possibly the other one would have exploded in sympathetic detonation, right? So that's like 8 megatons. Now consider that each of these bombs was 266 times the one that was dropped on Hiroshima. And you can kind of imagine the devastation, right? Possibly we would have a new coastline in North Carolina. So what's the lesson? The lesson is to eliminate single point of failure. Obviously, any discussion on single point of failure is incomplete without the Death Star, right? As the meme says it has the power to destroy entire planets, but it's defeated by a single explosion in one exhaust port, right? That led to the catastrophic failure. So single point of failure, it can be administrative security, right? And I've seen this happen at clients where all controls are handled by one key individual who doesn't follow established processes. So everything is in this person's mind, right? So obviously very intelligent and capable individual, right? But what happens if this person were to win the lottery or get hit by a bus? Similarly, in physical security, a data center with a single utility line, that's a single point of failure. Ideally, it should be different connections by different providers and additionally supplemented by UPS and power generators. In technical security, an example would be a single server delivering a critical service with no load balancing, with no failover. Obviously, this makes that particular server a single point of failure. And to detect these single points of failure, ideally should do an exhaustive risk assessment every year or even earlier if there is a major change in the operating environment. Now, with all these controls that I covered, there's still one important control that I didn't mention, right? And for this particular quote is very relevant. Bruce Schneier said, "Amateurs hack systems, professionals hack people." Now, even with all these controls, organizations are still getting breached, right? And that is because, as you can see in this cartoon, a wonderful piece of work, that with all these controls, you still have human error in the form of Dave. Apologies if there are any Daves in the audience, but it all boils down to the human element. I mean, humans can be the strongest and weakest links in cybersecurity, strongest if they know how to operate all these wonderful tools, and weakest if they don't. So education is key. Now, in conclusion, I would like to quote this great philosopher Kanye West, who said, "I was never really good at anything except for the ability to learn." So it is very important to share and learn. Mario Puzo wrote that a lawyer with a briefcase can steal more than 100 men with guns. Now, you replace the lawyer with his briefcase with a hacker with his or her laptop, right? And today in this connected world, threats span industries, they span countries, right? So it's very important for cybersecurity professionals to share and learn. And forums such as BSides Connecticut is obviously a great avenue to do just that. As Darth Vader, the great philanthropist, said, "Strong people don't put others down, they lift them up." Now, finally, it is good to share and learn, but it's also important to ask for help if needed, right? Because even if you're very knowledgeable, even if you're very experienced, you can still suffer from confirmation bias. You may be looking for answers which kind of speak to your own prejudices. And in these cases, an impartial third party can help. Obviously, this is a pitch for cybersecurity consultants like myself, but sometimes it does make sense to bring in that impartial third party to come in, ask the tough questions, and basically play the devil's advocate. So that's it. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you again for your time. I believe I have a few minutes, 10 minutes approximately, and I'm happy to take questions.